What a day. What a week. What a month. What a year. Pala, load shedding, economic decline, a pandemic. In fact, it's been a very tough few years for us here in South Africa. And with just days before that crucial ANC elective conference, one wonders what the future might hold. Well, the Brenthurst Foundation has done a little scenario planning and has released their paper, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly Scenarios for South Africa. I'm joined by Dr. Greg Mills, head of the Brenthurst Foundation. Greg, thank you so much for your time. Obviously, I'm going to ask you as a starting point, based on what we saw happening in Parliament today, do you think that decision is a move towards a good scenario or not?
Well, it's certainly a move towards stability, and it means that President Ramaphosa has cleared at least the first of the hurdles that we have to clear as a nation to try and find a way forward out of this mess, out of these series of systemic crises that we find ourselves in. Of course, the decisions taken by the ANC's conference later this week, and the decisions then taken 18 months later by voters at the 2024 election, and then decisions, and this is really the most interesting part, taken by political leaders about coalitions as the ANC slides below 50% of the vote, which seems to be likely as of the moment, is going to be perhaps the most important moment in South Africa's political history right now. And, most South Africans favor coalitions. 75% of them polled favor coalitions. And it seems as most favor a coalition, one that doesn't involve the ANC, which involves an ANC-DA government. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. And of course, finally, if the ANC and the EFF get together in a coalition to make up that 50%, then there's an altogether different future facing South Africa. But much depends on what Ramaphosa does, presuming he gets elected at the ANC conference, and how he uses his mandate, because until now he hasn't really used it effectively.
So the scenarios that you paint out are the good, the bad, the ugly, and then the fistful of sense. So I think one of the problems with understanding the good scenario, and I'd like you to explain it in more detail, is that for many South Africans who trusted Cyril Ramaphosa as Mr. Cleanup, we've seen the changes in SARS, we've seen the NPA moving. Now to have this Pala scandal hanging over him with clearly a lack of proper answers, one starts to wonder, is he part of the good? And it's created instability in itself. Talk to me about that. Do you believe that he's part of the good, the future for this country still?
Well, I mean, there's a conspiracy of optimism about President Ramaphosa always, and that to a certain extent is true for the ANC, that, there's a good ANC and it's better than no ANC, or it's certainly better than the bad ANC, in that Ramaphosa represents the goodness in the party. And a lot of voters have until now been convinced by that. But as you point out, that hasn't really delivered a great deal. And now comes Pala, now comes the level of uncertainty about his integrity. And I guess more important than that, Sally, is whether President Ramaphosa will, presuming he gets re-elected at the ANC Congress, whether he will change his ways, whether he will stand up and out as a leader of note and accelerate the reform process to enable the good to happen. Otherwise, we bumble along, sort of muddle along, as somewhere between the sort of fistful of sense with an oligarchy making money, extracting rents, and perhaps even descending into an ugly scenario.
All right, so I'm just going to quickly, briefly, for our viewers, go through what you've said about the good. And that is, the good, of course, is those who support constitutionalism, the rule of law. In this South Africa is proudly a constitutional democracy, builds relations with others. We could see a coalition of opposition parties with or without the ANC and ANC reformers. Then the bad, you say that's the scenarios which includes the ANC's radical economic transformation wing, going into coalition possibly with the EFF, which will be a rapid and precipitous decline in the country's finances as nationalism is implemented and the prosecution of party bosses for corruption ceases. The ugly scenario represents a continuation of the status quo. The ANC remains divided, unable to chart a clear path to reform. And then the fistful of sense is the fourth scenario. It's a close relative of the ugly, except cronyism rises as elite extraction accelerates and the state loses its attempt to rein in corruption and graft. On balance, what's going to make the change between those scenarios? How and who has the power to make the difference?
Well, the important thing about scenarios, and of course the most famous scenarios that were done in South Africa were those by Clem Santa and the Anglo-American team at the end of the 1980s, because basically they made clear the direction that South Africa was heading in, and we hope that we've done a similar job, and they lay out the options in front of us. And what they essentially say is that the future is not preordained. The citizens are not spectators in the theater of politics. And to the contrary, the right decisions by leaders, by party members, and by citizens, ultimately at the polls, can actually water the shoots of constitutionalism and democracy. And while coalition politics looks inevitable in South Africa, at least if the surveys are to be believed, the effect of this on the ANC remains less certain. Whether the Party of Liberation becomes the solution or remains a problem for South Africa's development is the choice of the ANC and its leadership, and ultimately of the South African electorate. And that's what we're trying to inform here, is better choices for the government. And, you know, economics, in a sense, is politics by other means. And once the politics at least have been straightened out in favor of Ramaphosa, it remains to be seen whether he can stand up in January and do something different. We remain hopeful, but we don't have any evidence until now that he'll do this.
Do you believe that Cyril Ramaphosa is the best option to lead the ANC at this point?
Well, the ANC has to decide that, and the voters will decide whether Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC is the best option for South Africa. And if you look at the polls currently, it seems as with the ANC below 50%, that there'll be some sort of coalition in the future. The real question is whether this is a coalition at the center and whether the center can cohere and you have a large enough majority in these coalitions that they don't become fractious, which is what we've seen continuously with these sort of personality political parties, and whether the ANC is part and parcel of that coherence, and then what happens to the party ultimately beyond that. But Ramaphosa until now has been very slow, very cautious in moving. He's not really engaged with the public. He's not a great taker of questions in the public, as you will probably know, Sally. He has to change his style, and he has to have a laser-like focus, essentially on one thing, and that's jobs. And if he does that, then he'll prove a historical figure. If he doesn't, he'll prove the figure that takes the ANC below 50%.
Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. Much appreciated, Dr. Greg Mills, head of the Brenthurst Foundation.